in this series. Started it last week. This is week 2 of our series called, what's it called? Neighborhood Watch. Let me ask you this. Or let me start off this way. Let me change it just how I'm going to start this. So Lori and I, we had these neighbors years ago, right? We lived in a condo. We were in the upper condo. They lived below us, and they were those neighbors, right? You know what I'm talking about? Those neighbors. Loud music, parties, fighting, right? We had to call the police one night. The husband had busted through a pane glass window, the door, right? She had locked him out, and he didn't want to be out, so he busted through the door, and it breaking everywhere, and we're calling police. I'm like, hey, knock it off. He's like, you want some of this? I'm like, yeah, have some of the police coming, because I ain't into this, right? Those neighbors, right? And they were those neighbors. How many have had those neighbors, right? Nobody, right? Okay, I got to tell you, if you've never had those neighbors, you were those neighbors, right? You were probably those neighbors. We've had those neighbors if you've lived long enough, right? Or that college roommate or person down the hall, right? We all know those people, right? And I think at the beginning, we'd have to admit we didn't like them, and they didn't really like us, and we've kind of all been there. But here's what we couldn't do. We couldn't say that they weren't our neighbors, right? We couldn't claim that they weren't our neighbors, and we couldn't dismiss or just disown the fact that they lived downstairs from us. They were our neighbors. And no matter how much we may not have enjoyed them being our neighbors, they were our neighbors. Now, we had a choice. We could just act and pretend like, these weren't good people, and we could just, put our head down and avert our eyes when they came by us, and we could do all those kind of things, right? But here's what Lori and I chose to do. Lori and I chose instead to show these people love and grace and dignity. And over time, we began to win them over. And to this day, 12 years later, their daughter still is really good friends with our children. And we won them over by loving them. Last week, we started this series by looking inward, right? We said that before we can identify and correctly live with our neighbors, that we first got to take a look at 2 important aspects of ourselves, our body and our spirit. And so we talked about food, and we talked about exercise, and we talked about sleep, and we talked about worship, and that was kind of the physical part of our being, our body. And then we also talked about a desire to improve. We talked about checking our motives. We talked about changing our why and changing our behavior. And all these are spiritual areas that we are looking at that we can improve. If you weren't able to be here last week, I don't usually say this, but I do highly recommend that message. And go back on our website and you can listen to that. It really leads up to where we're going to talk today. And today, my message is, I'm going to warn you, my message might be difficult for you. My message is going to be in your face today, okay? Is that all right? Because it's going to happen either way. So is that all right? Okay? So it's uncomfortable. What I'm going to say today is going to be uncomfortable. And what we're going to do is we're not going to look at the words of Paul Allen. We're going to look at the teachings of Jesus. We're not even going to look at one of the apostles. We're going to listen to Jesus directly. And as always, our heart's desire is to follow his example. And so, as Jesus often did, he's going to take a point and he's going to explain it in the way of a story. And today, we're going to look at what is probably Jesus' most famous story. We're going to look at the Good Samaritan. From Luke chapter 10, we're going to start with the 25th verse. And the 25th verse of Luke chapter 10 says this. It says, one day, everybody say, one day. One day, an expert in religious law. Okay, so religious law, right? So the law was given to us through Moses, right? And he wrote down, it began with those 10 important ones, the 10 commandments, and then there was all kinds of the laws that were given to us in what's the Pentateuch and Deuteronomy and Leviticus especially, and Exodus. They were given to us, and so this guy is an expert in those laws. This guy's an expert in the law that was given to Moses for the Jewish nation. So he knew what he was talking about, right? So he's a lawyer for the law of Moses. So he stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question. Teacher, what should we do to inherit eternal life? So this is kind of that, Jesus, can you give us the quick way to eternal life, right? What's the fastest way that I can have eternal life? And we're all kind of looking for that. We're all kind of wanting the fast track to eternal life. So he's asking him that question. And Jesus replied, this is funny how Jesus replies. Jesus replies, well, what does the law of Moses say? In other words, Jesus says, well, you're an expert. You tell me, Mr. Expert in religious law. I mean, why are you asking me? I don't have a expert in religious law sign on my door. That's yours. So Jesus answers his question with a question, right? And the man answered, well, you got to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind. And love your, everybody say neighbor. And love your neighbor as yourself. Verse 28. Right. Jesus told him, do this and you will live. Now, the way I see this story, Jesus says, right, do this and you will live. Have a nice day. And Jesus begins to walk away. Right? It's a great conversation. Thank you. You wanted to test me. It was a lot of fun. But, you know, I'm God. You're not. Funny. Haha. Have a nice day. And Jesus begins to walk away. And the man who wanted to justify his actions, so he asked Jesus, whoa. If I'm supposed to love the Lord my God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love my neighbor as myself, well, Jesus, who do you think my neighbor is? And Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits, and they stripped him of his clothes, they beat him, they left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at the man lying there, and he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised, everybody say despised. A despised Samaritan came along. You like how Jesus puts this? You know, not just a dude, not just a despised, you know. And the people around that are listening to this whole thing, they could feel what Jesus was talking about. A despised Samaritan. And everybody went, those Samaritans, right? And when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. And he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits, Jesus asked. The man replied, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, yes. Now go and do the same. Now, many of us are familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan. I would venture a guess that if not most of us, maybe all of us, have heard this story in some form or another. Right? And so this lawyer asked Jesus the question, who's my neighbor? The title of our message today is, who are the people in your neighborhood? Coming from the great Sesame Street song that we all listened to as children. If you didn't, you were deprived, and I feel sorry for you. Right? Who are the people in your neighborhood? And that's the question we should all be asking ourselves, right? Who are the people in my neighborhood? Who are my neighbors? Perhaps our minds immediately turn to the people who are directly live next to us. Oh, well, there's Sally, and there's John, and there's Brian, and there's, and the people down the street. And we think of the people that are in, like, our geographical neighborhood. Perhaps we think of our neighbor as someone that we like. We have a good relationship. Well, my Uncle Tony and my cousin Brian, and there's the guys that come over and they hang out and we have cookouts and we play some cards or whatever. And those are the people in my neighborhood. Or perhaps we think of our neighbors as those who are friendly to us. Well, my doctor and the people who bag my groceries at the grocery store, right? And we think of them as our neighbors. We think of people as our neighbors, those who look like us or believe like us and share a similar background as we do. See, the point is this, all of us have a preconceived idea, a preconceived notion of who our neighbor is. And Jesus, what he does is he takes the concept of neighbors and he takes it to a whole nother level. Like, okay, these people, Brantford, that's my neighborhood. Or people that I get along, they're my neighbors. But Jesus says, no. Let's expand this. We're going to blow up your idea of who your neighbor is. And so Jesus tells the story of this man who is traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. And here's what happens according to scholars today. They show us that Jerusalem and Jericho are 17 miles apart. But when Jesus says he went down to Jericho, there's actually a 3,000-foot descent in that 17 miles. There's a 3,000-foot descent from Jerusalem to Jericho. And along that path, it was very well known that was a kind of a murder's row. That there were bandits and there were bad people who were along that road who would try to do harm to people. And so it was normal in that time period for people to actually travel in pairs or travel in a group to make sure that there were enough people to overtake a group of thugs or a group of bandits that would try to do you harm. And so the fact that this man's walking alone is kind of stands out in this story. And so he's on this trip, on this dangerous road, alone, when he's accosted, when he is robbed, and when he's beaten along his journey. And after the traveler in our story is left half dead, 3 people, think about this. What do you think about this? 3 people encounter him. Everybody say 3 people. Okay, look at the person next to you who's fallen asleep and say 3 people. 3 people, right? But only one person helped him. Everybody say one person. 3 people see him. One person actually helps him. Now, after the story is done, he asks the lawyer, which of these 3 people who encounter him, which of these 3 people who come across him, which of these 3 people who basically stumble over him, which of these 3 people would you say was the neighbor of the man who fell into the hands of the robber? Now, I love how wise Jesus is. Jesus is so good at connecting with people. Because here's what Jesus does. Jesus creates a point of tension. Now, you understand what a point of tension is, right? If you don't, let me illustrate a point of tension for you, okay? You ready? Did you notice I got my hair cut today? Right? Every guy knows that point of tension, don't you? Because you know there's no right answer, right? There's tension immediately. Well, did you notice my haircut? And you're like, right? Because you know, every husband, every guy in this room knows you can't go, well, no, I didn't. Well, why didn't you? Right? And if you say yes, then why didn't you say something about it? Right? That's a point of tension. And so Jesus creates this point of tension. He's making a point because this man, he had to respond. He had to respond to what Jesus is saying. Well, who do you think his neighbor is? Can I buy a vow? I'd like to use my lifeline now, right? There's tension. And what was Jesus' point? Jesus' point was, who are the people in your neighborhood? Who's your neighbor? See, now it would have been a radical idea for a Samaritan and a Jew to be actual neighbors at the point of time when Jesus is telling this story. Samaritans and Jews did not live next door to each other, right? Back in segregated times here in America, we had the other side of the tracks, right? And most of us aren't old enough to remember those times. My parents are old enough to remember those times. They talk about in their town that there was literally a railroad track. And the white folks lived on one side of the tracks, and everybody else lived on the other side of the tracks. And literally, they knew the other side of the tracks. And in Jesus' time, the Samaritans and the Jews, there was a point where there was the other side of the tracks. And so it would not have been, the idea of a Samaritan and a Jew living as neighbors was absolutely ridiculous. It would not have happened. Think about the segregated South here in America. Samaritans were treated poorly. They were considered outcasts because they were a mixed race, right? They were half Jew and half Gentile. And so what happened was the Jews didn't like them because they were half Gentile, and the Gentiles didn't like them because they were half Jews. And so they were out in this no man's land. And for the Samaritans, it would have been a tough life to live because they weren't accepted anywhere. So we see even in biblical times that there were national and racial issues that were going on. And some weren't even accepting one another because of the color of their skin or because of their nationality that they came from. And so we could definitely see some modern applications for this, can't we, right? Think of refugees. Think of Muslims. Think of illegal aliens who are coming into America. So here's what I want you to do. If you don't have your notes, let us know. We'll get you a set of notes. But I want you to follow along because I want to talk to you. We can make the list more extensive than this. But I want to talk specifically about 4 groups of people that qualify as our neighbors that Jesus addressed in our story this morning. So let me talk first of all this morning, let me talk to you about our neighbor is anyone who is in need. Our neighbor is anyone who is in need. Right? There are people all around us who have needs. We see them every day, right? We had the privilege last Friday in our church to be able to reach out and to love on people with special needs. And that was a beautiful night. But what about the homeless? What about a single mom? What about someone who's been laid off from their job? What about a veteran who suffers from PTSD? What about our community, those people who have addictions? What about refugees from other countries where people are being persecuted and they're actually being slaughtered, entire villages and entire ethnic groups because of what religion they are? See, the man who was robbed was not there in his condition by choice. His need was based on circumstances that were out of his control. And I wonder this morning, what about those all around us who are in need? What are we doing about them? Because according to Jesus, they're our neighbors. See, the lawyer who was inquiring of Jesus didn't have the right intentions. He was trying to test Jesus. Well, Jesus, who do you say are our neighbors that we're supposed to love just like we love God and love the people next to us? Who are those people? And it says that the only reason that Jesus asked him this question, who is my neighbor, was because he wanted to justify himself. In other words, he wanted to look good. He wanted to look good in front of this religious teacher. And so the answer that Jesus gives him was an answer he was completely unprepared for. He wasn't ready for what Jesus was about to tell him. Even at the end of our story, it seems that this man didn't let go of his prejudices, right? Because when Jesus asked the lawyer who he thought was his neighbor, did you notice the wording that he used there? He didn't say the Samaritan man. He says, well, the one who had mercy on him. He couldn't even utter the words, that Samaritan, the Samaritan man. The good guy was a Samaritan. You want to know why he couldn't do that? Because in the stories that he had heard as a kid, probably growing up, the Jewish man always did the right thing, especially a priest and a temple assistant. They would always be the hero in the story. Never, never, never would he have heard a story about a Samaritan who was the hero. And so he couldn't even utter the words. Well, you know, Jesus. It's kind of how I read. Well, the one who was kind to him. I suppose it was the guy who showed him mercy. In the story, the Jewish priest walks right by him, sees him along the road, and just goes to the other side. The temple assistant is even worse because it says that he stopped and looked at him. Can you imagine the scene? He looks at him, oh man, what a mess. Oh man, this is terrible. Who could do this to him? Someone should help him. He turns. Walks to the other side of the street. Guy even looked down and saw him in his need. I wonder this morning, how many times do we stop and look at people in need and just keep driving, just keep walking? How often do we move to the other side of the street because we don't want to be near them, or they make us uncomfortable, or they smell, they look different, they're a different color, they're a different nationality. They don't come from my neighborhood. How many times do we secretly think, you know what, they're there because they deserve to be there. They're in that condition because of the choices they made in life. They're there because, let's be honest. If you're going to really press me on the issue, let's be honest. They deserve what they've got. See, that was the response of the Jewish priest. That was the response of the Jewish temple assistant. Who stopped? Who helped the man? The one who is different. So secondly, in your notes this morning, our neighbor is the one who's different. Our neighbor is the one that's different than us, right? See, we'd all like to picture ourselves on a missions trip in a foreign country. Like if I were to say, I've paid everybody's way here to go for a week to a foreign country, and we're going to take care of all the expenses, you know what? I would imagine a big number of us would be willing to go and do that, right? We love the pictures of us and them, those people. We have no problem being compassionate and loving to people there. But what happens when it lands on our doorstep? What happens when it's part of our story? Because that's what happened in this story, right? The man who was beaten was literally in the way. They literally had to move to the other side to avoid him. He was right there, right in front of them. They couldn't avoid him. They couldn't just dismiss the fact that he was there. See, they didn't have to raise money to go to his country to show him compassion or get on a plane to travel where he was. The Jewish man was right there in the street. See, we can get our heads around sending our money or going to another country to help those in need. But what about the kid that lives next door to us whose dad left? And he needs a father figure in his life, right? Or the man and the woman, or the woman who are getting out of prison, and they need someone to help them with the next steps to transition from that life to a new life. What about the family or the individual that's being neglected? What about those who don't look like us, or talk like us, or worship like us? See, the Samaritan was different from the Jewish men in every way, except one: geography. They all lived in Jerusalem. Everything about them was different. Everything about their story was different, except geography. Even though they lived in the same area, they could not have been more different. Their worlds were completely separate. And despite these differences, the Samaritan man made a determination to demonstrate compassion. He gave dignity and hope and healing to a man who was completely different than he was. But the greater truth in this, you want to know what the greater truth in this story is? The greater truth of this story is that despite our differences and despite the fact that we're remarkably different in every way, guess what? We're all the same. The truth of this story is every single one of us needs healing. Every single one of us is that man in the ditch. Every single one of us is hopeless in our situation. Every single one of us needs compassion and grace and mercy extended. Every single one of us is that man. Every single one of us is that person. Every single one of us deserves dignity And every single one of us is made in the likeness and the image of God. Even those who are outcast, like victims of human trafficking. I wanted you to see this video today.
He found me on social media.
She would force me to beg in the street.
My mother gave birth to me when she was 14 years old.
I've always had problems, as if I was born into problems.
I had to quit school early and go to work for my family to have money.
My dad chose drugs over us.
There's this awful feeling in your stomach when you know you're not wanted.
I already had friends working in a strip club. They introduced me to a trafficker.
I decided to run away. I might find love and kill someplace else.
I couldn't believe how much I made in one night. I thought I could control what happened from there.
He'd take pictures of us. I thought what they were doing to me was okay.
I had my hair and nails done. I felt beautiful.
He gave my family a computer and phones. My friends didn't have those, so I felt proud.
I just didn't realize that the person I thought was helping me and keeping me protected, he was really my pimp.
I love her. I thought she loved me.
But then he started saying rent's not free.
I was forced to work in a nail salon.
I was only 12 years old when I was first sold for sex.
Mama said, I'll be giving you to my American friend. I said okay. But when that time came, I tried to hide from him behind the cars in the parking lot.
I couldn't avoid the beatings. I begged to go home.
My hands were swollen from the work.
It hurt to walk.
I needed to do what he wanted because he paid for me.
People kept asking what was wrong. I kept making up answers.
I couldn't just tell my mom because she would have called the cops, and I didn't want that. She didn't know how these people act.
Then some people did call the police, but they would just come and then leave, and nothing would change.
And no one could help me. I thought my life would end there.
Someone called Love 146. I said I wasn't going to see them, but they kept showing up.
They knew what I needed.
The police was there and got us.
They brought me to Love 146.
Talking to Love 146 was the first time I realized what was really happening to me.
I was given a light and a way out when I met you.
Now, I try to remember when I'm angry or sad that it's okay to cry.
But everything that happened before is starting to become a smaller part of my life because it's being replaced with good memories.
A Love 146 worker is like a mom to me.
She showed me that I'm deserving of much more than this.
When everyone else just thought I was a bad kid, she listened.
I felt like it was my fault. But now I can explain to people how he tricked me.
The hardest part is knowing that they couldn't find him.
I imagined that he is just around the corner and he could shoot me.
Even if there are people who continue to harm children, there are more people who still can love children like us.
I am now living independently and I feel great.
Love 146 valued me. It was here that I became strong.
It was here that I learned how to be loved.
And how to love myself and other people.
I learned to stand on my own 2 feet.
I'm not just another statistic.
I'm not ready to give up.
I still have fight left in me.
I'm gonna make it.
That's it. Thanks. Powerful, huh? Yeah. So, our neighbors are those in need. Our neighbors are those who are different. Next, let me talk to you about our neighbor is anyone who is looked down on. Our neighbor is anyone who's looked down on. How many times do we have prejudice and just walk by people who are in need, right? How often do we see people who have nothing to offer us? The homeless, the disabled, maybe even a person with special needs, right? And we think, well, they've got nothing to give back, so, why do I owe them anything? And how many times do we just fail to help people because of the wrongs that have happened in our own life? And perhaps we see someone dressed differently than we do, right? And our first thought is terrorist, ghetto, lazy, right? Something that expresses our secret disdain for God's greatest creation. Remember last week? We talked about the fact that we are all created, fashioned in the image of God, and that God himself breathed the breath of life into every human being that exists. I want you to consider the thousands of immigrants who flood into the U.S. national borders. Now, here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to have a political statement here. Okay, so everybody, here's what you're not going to do. You're not going to find me after the service and tell me your political views. Okay? First of all, I'm not interested, and I love you. Secondly, we're going to have different political views. Whatever your political views are, that's fine. You can have your political views, and I understand that we have discourse in our country. And we have discourse here in our church. And we have people who are on all different sides of this political issue. I'm not here to talk about politics whatsoever today, right? But the fact is that many people have entered our nation's walls. And I wonder, in your notes this morning, I wonder if our mission field has actually come to us. I wonder if our mission field has actually come to us, right? See, we could differ on the different political nuances, but one thing is clear: we're called to put Christ's words into action, to be a neighbor to those that are already here and to those who enter our country. Now, your response may be, well, they might be terrorists, Pastor Paul. As a matter of fact, even after I said, please don't tell me your political views, I had someone grab me after service and tell me their political views. Well, what about the terrorists? I'll go, I just answered that question for you, but anyways, let me answer it again. Let me say this to you. What if they are? What if they are? Could it be that when we demonstrate, is it possible that the love of Christ is great enough to change their political views? And let me say this as well. We wrestle not with flesh and blood. We don't hate people. We can disagree about ideology, and we can even hate someone's ideology. But we love people. Why? Because they're our neighbors. Could it be that those same people who come with harmful intent, that if we loved on them and showed them the love of Christ, that we could change their heart and their mind? See, we don't have to go to Haiti to love Haitians here in America, right? We don't have to go to Muslim countries to win Muslims to Christ. They're right here in our back door. We are a stone's throw from New York, and we're a stone's throw from Boston, where we live. We are so strategically placed here at Shoreline Community Church. In New York City, did you know that there are 800 languages spoken in New York City? And in Boston, there are 140 other languages. Now, to me, all Bostonians sound weird, okay? So, like, all of Boston has it. That should be one language itself, right? Have you seen the commercial where they're parking the car, right? How funny is that? Like, by themselves, we need to send someone, just an interpreter, just to talk to people in Boston, right? Think about that, 140 languages in Boston, 800 right here in New York City. Our mission field is right in our backyard. Jesus finishes up his conversation with the self-righteous lawyer by saying this: go, do likewise. The Samaritan had no reason to help this Jewish man, right? The Samaritan would have completely have been justified to keep right on walking. The Samaritan was the only one of the three who should have left the man alone. Right? He was the cultural outcast. He was the foreigner. He was the half-breed. And much like the Palestinians and the Jews today, the Samaritans and the Jews of that day were kind of at war with each other. They didn't like each other. They didn't accept each other. They didn't want to have any dialogue or relations with each other. They hated one another. And this Samaritan could have spit in the eye of that Jewish man and kept right on walking. And nobody, if Jesus had said that about the Samaritan in that story, all the Jews around him would have said, yeah, that's about right. That's how the story would go. Yeah, that makes sense. He's right to do that, right? He could have done that because of all the harm and the hurt to himself and to his race. No one would have faulted him if he had done so. And yet, Jesus says to the lawyer, be like the Samaritan. Be like the Samaritan. Are you kidding me? Love those who appear to be unlovable, and with those that you disagree. And that leads to our last group of people, because next Jesus talks about the fact that our enemies are our neighbors. Our enemies are our neighbors. See, the Samaritan man recognized who this guy was. He would have known that he was a Jewish man. The priest and the temple assistant were culturally responsible to stop and help the man. I mean, like if you heard a story about Pastor Paul walking along and seeing some guy who was beaten on a street, you would automatically think, well, of course my pastor would stop and help. He's Pastor Paul. He's the pastor. And these are two people who are religiously, absolutely. Everybody would think, well, if anyone would stop and help them, it would be a priest and a assistant in the temple. Of course they would. They were culturally responsible to help this man. And yet, the sworn enemy of this man was the only one who provided dignity and healing to him. And Jesus' point was that the man who was sworn as his enemy was the guy who showed him mercy. The sworn enemy of this man was the one who was gracious. The sworn enemy of this man provided dignity and healing to his enemy. So I begin to wrap this up. Let me tell you about the Zion Lutheran Church of all places, Des Moines, Iowa, right? This church, this Zion Lutheran Church, holds 5 services in 4 languages. Their congregation speaks 12 languages, from Arabic to Swahili. And what's even more remarkable about this church, this Lutheran church in Des Moines, Iowa, is that the Rwandan natives, right, who are from the Hutu and Tutsi tribes, worship together. Now, we hear that and we're like, okay, so what's the big deal? Well, let me tell you about it. The Hutus were responsible for the genocide of over 1 million Tutsis in the early 1990s. Think about that. You talk about sworn enemies of one another. Racial discrimination was rampant in this little country. And only in recent years have the plight and the atmosphere and the environment changed. But the common bond of the cross of Jesus Christ has these two enemies, these two groups of enemies, sit side by side and worship together every Sunday. And this church brings hope in an age of rampant discrimination. I wonder this morning, is this what Jesus was talking about when he said to love your neighbor? To reach out even to current or former enemies, to sit next to each other and to worship the same Savior. See, no matter what your political feelings are about refugees or foreigners, even if you don't think they belong in the United States, if you want a wall or don't want a wall, whatever your political views are, can I tell you something? This isn't a political issue. This isn't a political issue for followers of Jesus Christ. It doesn't matter even if we're at war with another country. As followers of Christ, we have an obligation to love our enemies, to treat every human being as God's creation. That includes illegal immigrants, foreigners, Muslims. And we don't have to agree. That's fine. We don't even have to like the politics. That's okay. But if we're followers of Christ and we're followers of Jesus' teaching, then every person on the planet is our neighbor. Especially those who are in need, especially those who are different, especially those who are looked down on, and yes, especially our enemies. And if we needed any greater example, Jesus himself is our example. When he died for people who didn't care about him, when he died for people who didn't love him, when he died for people who spit in his face and said they would never, never want anything from him, Jesus called us his neighbors. Let me read to you how this happens in Romans chapter 5, verse 6. It says this: when we were utterly helpless, Christ came at just the right time. When we were in need and couldn't do anything for ourselves, Christ loved us. He came at just the right time. Now, most people would not be willing to die for an upright person, though someone might perhaps be willing to die for a person who is especially good. But, God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us when we cleaned everything up. Listen, when we got it all together, Christ was like, okay, I'll die for them. Right? When we became religious, Christ died for us. When we stopped doing bad stuff, Christ died for us. No, how about you read it with me? While we were still sinners. And since we have been made right in God's sight by the blood of Christ, he will certainly save us from God's condemnation. We are far away. When we are his enemies, when we didn't know who he was, and when we didn't care, and when we had no desire for him, he died for us. So I wonder this morning, how can we follow his example? Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you that you've set the example for us. It's hard. This is a hard message. This definitely isn't one of those rah, jump up and down. It's a tough message because it hits every one of us. We have an idea of who our neighbor is, and we have an idea of that we love everybody, and yet when we're confronted with the reality of it, I think most of us, if not all of us, starting right here, myself, would say, I fall way short. But you love us. And you've demonstrated love for us, and so we can love others. God, I pray this afternoon that for each one of us that struggles with this, I pray that we go home and we wrestle with this. We may not even agree with this. I pray that we go home and we struggle with this. I pray that we'd realize that these aren't the words of any person but Jesus himself, which compels us to do something. It compels us to confront ourselves. Compels us to confront why we believe what we believe, or why we do what we do, and how we act and what we say and our reactions. God, it compels us. In the same way that the tension demanded a response from this young lawyer, it demands a response from us. How will we respond? Help us. Help us in our weak areas. Help us to love the unlovable. Help us to love the outcast. Help us to love those who are in need. Help us to love our enemies. God, I pray that no one would be able to walk away from this message and not be discontent to the point of change. Start in me. I ask this in your name. Amen. Let me give you a benediction today from Ephesians chapter 3, Then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust in him. Your roots will grow down into God's love and keep you strong. And may you have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, and how deep his love is. May you experience the love of Christ, though it is too great to understand fully. Then you will be made complete with all of the fullness of life and power that comes from God. God bless you. We love you.